Sometimes a photograph is frightening, not because of what is in it, but because of who should not be there, and yet is. The envelope was mislabeled, filed under Prescott Miscellaneous, 1907-1912, and buried in a steel drawer that had not been opened in decades. Doctor of Historical Sciences. Alan Gray discovered it by accident during a routine audit of the Prescott Municipal Archive, a squat limestone building that smelled of dust, iron, and old paper. The photograph inside was heavier than expected, mounted on thick board, its edges darkened by time. At first glance, it was unremarkable, the kind of family portrait that filled thousands of archival boxes across America. A man stood at the center, mustached, rigid, wearing a three-piece suit with a watch chain draped confidently across his vest. His posture communicated ownership of property, of people, of the moment itself. Beside him sat his wife, straight-backed in a dark dress, hands folded with practiced restraint. An older teenage daughter stood just behind her chair. A young boy clutched a wooden rocking horse. Three small girls sat on an ornate carpet in the foreground. Identical white dresses. Identical expressions. Order, control, respectability. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. Allen had cataloged hundreds of similar images. Early 20th century families posed this way deliberately. Symmetry, hierarchy, silence. But something in this photograph resisted being filed and forgotten. He could not immediately say why. The longer he looked, the more the image seemed to push back against him, as if daring him to notice what had been carefully ignored. His eyes drifted left. There, at the very edge of the frame, stood a tall floor mirror. It was decorative, expensive, its carved frame catching the light of the studio lamps. At first, Allen assumed it reflected the backs of the assembled family, a common accident in early photography. But when he leaned closer, the room went very still. The mirror did not reflect the people in front of the camera. Instead, it showed an entirely different scene. In the reflection stood a girl with long, loose hair, her hands pressed tightly to her face, fingers splayed as if holding back a scream or wiping away tears. Her posture was unmistakable: panic, grief, or terror frozen mid-gesture. Beside her, partially turned away, stood another figure dressed in white. Only the back was visible. Neither appeared anywhere in the actual room captured by the lens. Allen felt a chill move slowly up his spine. The geometry made no sense. The angle of the mirror revealed a section of the studio that should have been empty space, a narrow corridor between the mirror and the eldest daughter. There was no one standing there, and yet the reflection insisted otherwise. He enlarged the image digitally, isolating the mirror. The girl's face was obscured by her hands, but her dress matched the white fabric worn by the three youngest girls seated on the carpet. Only she was older, taller, thinner, her body charged with emotion rather than stillness. The children in the foreground appeared unnaturally calm, their expressions blank, their small hands folded, as if instructed not to move. Allen returned his attention to the father. Records identified him as Thomas Prescott, a man known in local histories for his meticulous nature, his rigid household rules, his reputation for absolute obedience. Prescott paid extra for studio photography, demanded retakes when a cuff was crooked or a posture displeased him. That such a man would tolerate an uncontrolled element in his family portrait, an extra figure, an interruption, was inconceivable, unless it had not been tolerated at all. The boy holding the rocking horse drew Allen's eye next. The child was not playing. He was gripping the toy tightly with both hands, knuckles pale, shoulders raised. His gaze did not meet the camera. It angled slightly left, toward the mirror. Children, Allen knew, often reacted to things adults refused to acknowledge. The more he studied the photograph, the clearer the pattern became. This was not a defect, not a trick of light. Forensic analysis later confirmed the mirror's reflection was chemically consistent with the rest of the negative. The mirror had recorded something real, someone real. who had stood there when the shutter clicked. But someone had been removed. A retoucher had carefully erased the girl from the main image, smoothing the background, correcting the mistake. Only the mirror had been forgotten. Only the reflection had refused to comply. Alan sat back from his screen, the archive lights humming faintly overhead. The photograph did not show a family of 7 as the records claimed. It showed 8, and one of them was never meant to be seen. Alan Gray did not sleep the night after cataloging the Prescott photograph. By morning, the image had followed him into dreams. Always the same moment, always the same refusal to explain itself. At first light, he returned to the archive, bypassing the public reading room and unlocking the restricted storage where municipal records older than a century were kept, under brittle folders and false order. If the mirror showed someone who should not be there, the explanation, he believed, would not be found in the photograph alone. It would be found in what surrounded it, in the silences. He began with the census rolls. The Prescott household appeared in the 1910 federal census exactly as the photograph suggested. Thomas Prescott, head of household, his wife Eleanor, one daughter aged 17, one son aged 8, and 3 daughters aged 5, 5, and 5. Triplets. Identical ages, identical notation, no irregularities. No 8th child. Alan frowned. Infant mortality was common. Missing children were common. But erasure that clean was not. He pulled church baptismal records next, expecting at least a trace. An infant buried young, a stillbirth, a name crossed out. The Prescott family attended First Covenant Church regularly. Their donations were meticulously recorded. Their pew was assigned. Their births and baptisms were noted with bureaucratic devotion. 6 children, not 7, not 8. It was as if the girl in the mirror had never existed. Yet something about the triplets troubled him. 3 daughters born within minutes of one another, all surviving infancy, all dressed identically in the photograph, yet none displaying the restlessness common to young children. Their hands were folded too neatly. Their spines were straight. Their faces carried no curiosity, no resistance. They looked less like children than rehearsed figures placed carefully into the frame. Alan returned to the digital enlargement of the mirror. The reflected girl's hair was loose, unbound, unbraided, uncorrected. In that era, this was not accidental. Girls were restrained, groomed, disciplined into presentability. Loose hair signaled neglect, illness, or refusal. Her hands pressed to her face suggested distress that could not be controlled or concealed. Beside her stood the second figure, the one in white, turned away. The outline was indistinct, but the posture was unmistakably adult. Someone watching. Someone standing between her and the family. Alan's thoughts circled an explanation few historians like to articulate plainly. Hidden children. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, families quietly concealed children deemed unfit, epileptic, developmentally delayed, mentally ill, or simply uncontrollable. They were kept out of sight, described euphemistically as sent away, or never recorded at all. Institutions, attics, locked rooms, relatives who agreed not to ask questions. But even hidden children left traces, unless someone worked very hard to remove them. Alan requested access to the Prescott estate probate file. It arrived an hour later, thinner than expected. Thomas Prescott had died suddenly in 1914. His will was brief. Assets distributed cleanly. No contested claims. No guardianships. No mention of medical expenses beyond routine care. But tucked into the back of the file was an accounting ledger, a household expense book, likely kept by Eleanor Prescott herself. Alan turned the pages slowly, fingers careful against the fragile paper. Food, coal, tuition, clothing. Then, repeated every month for nearly 4 years, a single line item appeared. Special provisions. No description. No recipient. The amount fluctuated, but it never disappeared. Not until 1909. The photograph was dated 1908. The following year, the line item ended abruptly. Alan felt the room narrow around him. He searched death notices next. There was no obituary for a Prescott child, no funeral record, no burial plot purchased under the family name during that period. Whatever happened to the girl in the mirror did not pass through public channels. The photograph, then, captured something not meant to survive. A moment before correction, before removal, before the family's version of itself was sealed permanently into paper and memory. And the mirror, careless, angled, antique, had betrayed them. Alan closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Outside the archive windows, traffic moved normally, unaware of the quiet violence preserved in a single image upstairs. The girl with her hands to her face had been present. She had been seen. And someone had decided very deliberately that she would not be allowed to remain. Alan's next step took him out of the archive and into a quieter, more dangerous territory: private records. The Prescott family had commissioned their portrait from Whitcomb and Hale Studio, a respected photography house operating in the city between 1896 and 1912. Studio records were rarely preserved in full. Most had been discarded when glass negatives cracked or fashions changed. But fragments sometimes survived in trade ledgers, insurance claims, or lawsuits. Alan found the reference buried in a municipal fire inspection report. Whitcomb and Hale had suffered a small electrical fire in 1916. The damage was minor, but the city required a full inventory of materials lost or removed. Attached to the report was a partial list of negatives transferred off-site prior to the fire for private retention by client request. One entry stopped him cold: Prescott family portrait, negative altered per instruction. There was no further explanation. Alan requested the studio's surviving correspondence files from a private collector who had acquired them decades earlier. They arrived in a flat box, brittle and disordered. Most were invoices, chemical orders, polite thank you notes from satisfied clients. But tucked between two cracked ledger pages was a single carbon copy of a letter dated 3 days after the Prescott portrait session. The handwriting was careful, restrained. Mr. Hale, my husband insists the final image must reflect order. You understand the importance of appearances. The matter discussed during the sitting is not to be preserved. Please ensure the correction is complete. It was unsigned. Alan read it twice, then a third time. The matter discussed during the sitting. That phrasing implied argument, disagreement, something that could not be solved quietly. He turned back to the photograph, studying the eldest daughter now with new attention. She stood just behind her mother's chair, one hand resting lightly on the wood. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes were not empty like the others. They were fixed forward, with attention that suggested endurance rather than calm. In the mirror's reflection, the crying girl stood closest to her. Too close. Alan overlaid the mirror geometry digitally, reconstructing positions. The reflected girl occupied the exact space where the eldest daughter's body blocked the camera's view. If she had stepped forward even a few inches, the hidden child would have appeared directly in the frame, impossible to erase cleanly, which meant someone had intervened. Someone had moved her. The second figure in white, the one turned away, now made sense. It was not a ghost, not a trick of exposure. It was an adult dressed in white clothing, consistent with institutional or domestic supervision. A nurse, a handler, someone whose job was to restrain, redirect, and remove. Alan searched medical directories. In 1906, a private sanitarium operated less than 4 miles from the Prescott residence, advertising discreet care for nervous conditions in youth. Its records were sealed following a scandal in 1915 involving patient mistreatment. Most admissions were never made public, but one ledger survived. A single intake note listed a female child, unnamed, admitted under private guardianship in late 1908. Age, approximately 12. Hair, unmanaged. Condition, episodes of agitation. Discharged, 1909. No further notes. The timing aligned perfectly. Alan sat back, the weight of it settling slowly. The photograph did not capture a haunting. It captured a negotiation, a moment when a family decided what would be remembered and what would be erased. The girl in the mirror had been brought into the studio, perhaps under protest, perhaps under supervision, to complete the image of unity. Something went wrong. She reacted. She broke the pose. She reminded them she existed. So she was removed, not only from the photograph, but from the family's public life. The retoucher erased her body from the negative, smoothing the space where she stood. The studio complied. The records complied. The census complied. The church complied. Only the mirror refused. Alan closed the folder and shut off the lamp above his desk. The archive returned to shadow, rows of shelves absorbing the truth without comment. The photograph upstairs no longer felt like evidence. It felt like an accusation. What troubled Alan most was not the act of removal itself, but its precision. Hidden children were not uncommon. What was uncommon was how completely this one had been excised. No name, no burial, no transfer of guardianship, no whispered euphemism preserved in correspondence. It suggested not shame alone, but fear. Fear of contamination, of exposure, of a truth that could not be allowed to circulate even privately. Alan returned again to the photograph, this time focusing not on the mirror, but on the faces that refused to look back. The mother, Eleanor Prescott, sat rigid in her chair. Her hands were folded, but the fingers pressed too tightly together, the knuckles faintly pale. She was not relaxed. She was enduring. Her gaze passed through the camera, unfocused, as if she had already decided not to see whatever was happening to her left. The eldest daughter's expression was worse. Teenage girls in early studio portraits often struggled with stillness. Impatience, curiosity, self-consciousness crept into their faces. But this girl displayed none of it. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders were squared. She looked not frightened, but resigned, as if she had already been told what would happen next. Alan examined her school records. She left formal education abruptly in 1909, despite strong academic performance. No explanation given. No illness recorded. She did not marry. She did not move away. Instead, she remained in the Prescott household until her father's death, after which she vanished from city directories entirely. No address, no employment, no death certificate. The family lost 2 daughters that year. Alan consulted legal journals from the period, searching for precedents. He found one reference, obscure, buried in a regional law review, discussing the legal ambiguity of private dependence. Children deemed unmanageable could be placed under care without formal adoption or commitment, provided the family maintained financial responsibility and secrecy. Secrecy was the point. The Mirror Girl's condition, agitation, emotional expression, refusal to remain still, would have been labeled dangerous, not because it threatened others, but because it threatened the image Thomas Prescott had constructed around his family. A family defined by symmetry, obedience, and silence could not tolerate a child who cried in public, who moved unpredictably, who revealed distress. Alan imagined the studio that day, the heavy camera, the long exposure, the smell of chemicals and dust, the children instructed to remain still, the nurse standing just out of frame, dressed in white, holding authority that came not from affection, but from instruction. The girl with loose hair breaks. She lifts her hands to her face. She makes noise, perhaps not loud, but enough. Enough to disrupt the moment. Enough for Thomas Prescott to notice. Enough for a decision to be made. The retoucher's work had been careful but imperfect. He erased the body, not the absence. The mirror preserved what the family could not fully control: the truth of presence. The fact that the child had stood there. The fact that she had watched them pose without her. Alan felt a growing certainty that the photograph was not taken before the erasure, but during it. A final inclusion before exclusion. The girl had been allowed into the room one last time, perhaps under protest from the nurse, perhaps at the insistence of Eleanor, perhaps as a compromise. Then, she was removed, physically and historically, in the same motion. The mirror did not show a ghost, it showed the cost. Alan closed his notes and shut down his workstation. Outside, the archive lights dimmed automatically, leaving the room in twilight. He knew what he had uncovered would never be officially acknowledged. There would be no correction to the record, no restored name, no justice. But the photograph would remain, waiting. The girl with her hands to her face would continue to stand there, reflected in glass, watching a family pretend she had never existed. And that, Alan realized, was the most honest record the Prescott Archive contained. Alan understood, by the 5th week of his investigation, that he had reached the boundary of what records were willing to give. Beyond that boundary lay only inference, absence, and deliberate silence. He returned one last time to the Prescott residence file: property surveys, renovation permits, complaints from neighbors about noise. Nothing overt, nothing criminal. But one document, previously overlooked, surfaced during a reread: a minor architectural amendment filed in early 1909. Interior modification, reinforcement of upper floor room, soundproofing materials approved, no reason given. Soundproofing was not common in private homes of that era. It was expensive, specialized, typically reserved for music rooms or industrial offices, not family residences. Alan traced the floor plan. The reinforced room was positioned above the formal parlor, directly above where the family photograph had likely been taken in the studio months earlier. The room had no external windows added, no decorative upgrades, no listed function. A space made quieter, a space made contained. The sanitarium ledger listed the girl's discharge in late 1909. Discharge did not imply recovery. It implied return. Return to a family prepared now to manage her invisibly. There were no further medical payments recorded after that year. No institutional fees, no doctor's visits tied to special provisions. The expense line ended because the solution had been internalized. Alan imagined the house after that, meals eaten below while footsteps paced overhead. The triplets growing older under strict instruction not to ask questions. The boy taught early that silence was protection. The eldest daughter, already trained in endurance, absorbing responsibility that should never have been hers. And the girl with loose hair? She lived, but she did not exist. Families like the Prescotts did not coal inconvenient children. They erased them slowly. They reduced them to rooms, routines, and supervision. They removed their names from language. They taught everyone else how not to see. Alan searched for one final trace: a death. He found it, barely. In 1926, a burial record listed a female interred in a municipal grave under the designation dependent, age unknown. No name, no family attribution. Cause of death: exhaustion following prolonged illness. Burial paid for privately. The payment came from a trust that had once borne the Prescott name, dissolved 2 years later. There was no headstone. Alan printed the photograph one final time and placed it beside the burial record. The mirror girl's hands still covered her face, frozen in the moment before she understood what was happening. Perhaps she already did. The photograph had never been meant to remember her. It had been meant to prove she was gone. A corrected image of a corrected family. But it failed. Because mirrors do not obey. They record what stands before them, not what is permitted. Alan returned the photograph to its sleeve and refiled it exactly where he had found it. He made no public announcement. He submitted no article. He understood now why no one before him had followed the thread to its end. The archive did not want resolution. It wanted containment. Yet long after the records fell silent, one thing remained uncontrollable: the image itself. Anyone who looked closely enough would see her, Anyone who noticed the wrong reflection would understand that someone had been pushed out of history without consent. The girl remained, hands to her face, watching. And as long as the photograph existed, the family's lie would never be complete. Alan thought the investigation was finished. Then, 3 months later, a letter arrived. It bore no return address and was postmarked from a neighboring county, the ink faint as if the stamp had been pressed reluctantly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and nothing else. No greeting, no signature. You're looking in the right place, but not the right room. Alan read the sentence several times before a quiet unease settled over him. The Prescott case had never been made public. He had spoken of it to no one outside the archive. The photograph had been refiled. The records returned to their shelves. By all visible measures, the matter had ended. Someone else had been watching. The letter compelled him back to the Prescott residence, now long divided into apartments and offices. The building retained its original footprint, though its interior had been modified repeatedly over the decades. Alan obtained temporary access under the pretense of historical documentation, accompanied by a maintenance supervisor who showed little interest in the house's past. But Alan did not need a guide. He knew where to go. The reinforced upper room no longer existed as such. Renovations in the 1950s had subdivided the floor, turning it into two narrow units. Drywall concealed the original structure. But the supervisor mentioned, almost casually, that one section had always been odd, walls thicker than necessary, acoustics strangely dead. Alan asked for a few minutes alone. Behind a false panel in a storage closet, he found it. The original wall. It had been sealed, not demolished. The soundproofing material, horsehair, felt, layered wood, remained intact behind newer construction. When Alan pressed his palm against it, the surface absorbed the contact unnaturally, swallowing sound. A room designed not just to contain noise, but to deny it. Inside the wall cavity between studs, something else had been left behind. A scrap of fabric, white cotton, yellowed with age, torn, not cut. Along one edge, faint embroidery survived, a simple floral pattern identical to the trim visible on the dresses worn by the three youngest girls in the photograph. And near the hem, a stain darkened the cloth, irregular and old. Alan did not need forensic confirmation to understand what he was holding. This was not evidence of a violent act in the conventional sense. It was worse. It was evidence of endurance, of prolonged presence in a space never meant to be occupied, of a life reduced to fabric, walls, and routine. The girl in the mirror had not been institutionalized permanently. She had been brought home and placed where she could not interrupt appearances again. The mirror captured her final moment of visibility. After that, she existed only above the family, unheard. Alan replaced the panel carefully and returned the scrap to where it had been found. Removing it would have meant admitting responsibility. He was not sure the archive, or he, was prepared for that. As he left the building, he noticed something he had missed before. In the front hallway, beneath layers of paint, faint marks marred the wall near the staircase. Not decorative, not structural. Scratches worn smooth over time, clustered at shoulder height, hand height. Someone had stood there often, waiting. Alan understood now why the mirror image was so powerful. It was not just a mistake preserved in glass. It was resistance. The only moment the girl was allowed to assert herself, hands raised, emotion visible, before she was corrected into silence. The family succeeded in everything else, but they failed to control reflection. The letter's message echoed back to him as he stepped into the street, not the right room. History, Alan realized, was not hidden in documents alone. It was embedded in architecture, in altered spaces, in walls built thicker than necessary, in rooms designed to swallow sound and lives designed to disappear without trace. The photograph had not ended the story. It had merely marked the last moment the girl was allowed to be seen. Alan never answered the letter. There was no response to send, no address to return it to, and no illusion left to preserve. By then, the investigation had ceased to feel like research at all. It felt like trespass into a private silence that had survived because no one forced it into the light. The archive accepted the photograph back without resistance. It always had. Weeks passed, months. The Prescott image remained exactly where it had been for over a century, catalogued incorrectly, mislabeled, misinterpreted. Visitors passed it without pause. Students glanced and moved on. No one noticed the mirror unless they were already looking for absence. Alan understood now why history often ends the way it does. Not with truth, but with exhaustion. There was no trial to reopen, no descendants demanding answers, no confession waiting to be unearthed. The people who had made the decision were long dead. The systems that allowed it had merely evolved, not vanished. The girl in the mirror had not been murdered in the way records understand murder. She had been managed, contained, corrected. The archive did not require her name to function. It did not require acknowledgement. The photograph had served its purpose perfectly. It showed a family intact, orderly, complete. Everything else was incidental. One evening, before closing the building for the last time before winter, Alan stood alone in the photograph room. He removed the image from its sleeve and held it under the dim archival light. The mirror caught his reflection now, overlaying his face atop the girl's obscured one. For a moment, it looked as if he stood where she once had. He imagined her final years, not in scenes of overt cruelty, but in routines stripped of choice. The sound-dampened room, the nurse replaced by obligation. The family below growing quieter, more practiced at forgetting. A girl aging without milestones, without witnesses, without language that allowed her to be described. When she died, there had been no urgency, no disruption, just paperwork filed under dependency, paid quietly, buried without name. No one asked if she had been afraid. No one needed to. The photograph slid back into its sleeve with a dry, papery sound. Alan did not leave a note, did not alter the catalog, did not annotate the finding. He understood that intervention would only create another layer of control, another version of the story imposed from above. Some truths, he realized, are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to remain visible only at the edges. The mirror would continue to reflect her. The girl would continue to stand there, hands to her face, eternally present at the moment she was excluded. Anyone who noticed would feel the same unease, the same wrongness, and most would turn away. That, too, was part of the design. As Alan turned off the lights and locked the archive doors behind him, the building settled into silence, shelves holding their secrets without complaint. Inside, the photograph waited. The family would remain 7 on paper, and the 8th child, never named, never acknowledged, would remain where she had always been, in reflection, in omission, in the space history refuses to explain.